Welcome to this episode of Hames Henderson Chilliwack Now. As with all our episodes, we'll be exploring issues we think are relevant to Chilliwack now. And as always, Paul Henderson, the editor of the Chilliwack Progress, is the co-host. Paul.
Thanks, Clint. Happy to be here and helping to bring clarity to the important issues of the day. When we return, we're going to talk about public safety. What makes a community safe? What are the issues that make us feel unsafe? What is happening with crime in our community? And what are the root causes of crime?
We'll be back with more after we hear from this message from our sponsor, Zacharias Vickers. Welcome back. You know, there's often a disconnect between a sense of safety and our actual safety in a community. The presence of people who are homeless, people who are struggling with mental health issues and or addictions can give us a feeling of being unsafe. But are we? What creates safety? What conditions create crime?
Our guests today have a long history of involvement with community safety, providing supports to people before their lives may spiral to breaking the law to survive. Dr. Steve Esau is the Director of Operations for the Fraser Valley East for the Pacific Community Resources Society. Steve joined PCRS in 2011 and has worked over 15 years in counseling and social sector fields. His main focus has been researching and implementing innovative strategies in the field of substance use and trauma. Steve is a doctorate in behavioral health, as well as master's in marriage, family, and child counseling.
And Steve is on the left, and Bud Mercer is in the middle, and Bud has been serving Chilliwack as a councillor since November 2018. Now retired, Councillor Mercer's RCMP career spanned 34 years and included the title of Assistant Commissioner with the RCMP and Chief Operating Officer for the Vancouver 2010 Winter Olympics. His extensive policing background includes municipal, provincial, federal, and international work experience. Over the past 2 years, he's been chairing a special committee, reviewing and making recommendations and implementing plans for a safer community.
And Aaron Pete on the right here. Aaron is a member of Chawathil First Nation within the Stalo territory. Aaron recently completed his law degree at Peter A. Allard School of Law. He is the host of the Bigger Than Me podcast, writer on Substack, and he also sits on the board of directors of the Chilliwack Cultural Center. Welcome.
Welcome, everyone. So I want to ask the first question, is Chilliwack safe? Steve.
Subjective to the person answering. Where do you live? What do you do? Are you involving yourself in certain scenarios that could compromise your safety? Is Chilliwack safe? To some, they'd say absolutely. To some, absolutely not.
Bud?
I somewhat agree with that. I believe Chilliwack is safe. I don't think people are in imminent risk walking down the street. Chilliwack's not without its warts. We all accept that. And there's a lot of work to do, but I believe Chilliwack is safe.
Aaron?
I would say that one of the interesting aspects is that I do think it's subjective, but I think that the unique aspect is that there's communities that start to develop when there is a sense of unsafety. And those communities build strength and resilience over time and hopefully are able to work towards making a sense of safety stronger.
What do you mean by communities?
So as a Native Core worker, I had the opportunity to work with many people that we'll be discussing today and the challenges that they're facing. And I think one of the unique challenges that maybe goes overlooked is that they develop such a strong relationship in their homeless communities. There's this sense of protectiveness that they don't want to abandon people who've been there for them when they're sleeping at night. And so I think that's something that is hard to combat, because to discourage that seems perhaps inhuman, but there's an important element of that we need to find a solution to that doesn't mean taking people away from these communities that make them feel safe.
That's an interesting point. I worked with and talked with lots of folks who've worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver, and they say in some respects the downtown east side of Vancouver is one of the most welcoming neighborhoods in the city if you happen to be struggling with many of the things that people are struggling with. It's a very accepting place and it's a very welcoming place. However, we might look at that from our perspective and say, yeah, but people aren't well. People are, we see them as being at risk. So many people that we see that are struggling with shelter, drug addictions, their own mental health, we assume often, and this goes to what you're saying, that the presence of those folks in our community decreases public safety. Steve, what would you say to that?
The answer I give is, how well do you know them? So there's like the phrase of pneuma, where it's like an unknown, where if it's unknown, it becomes more scary, and then we project it as maybe unsafe. But if you get to know these people, you'll see how loving and caring they actually are. And now that also goes to the asterisk to that, where someone under the influence or severe mental health may be out of complete control of their body and do things that are outside of their character when they're sober. So you might meet two different people, but that person behind the addiction is where you can feel completely safe with.
I see that a lot when you talk to folks in the community. They understand that the particular struggles that people are going through, so they make an assumption that there's a level of safety or unsafety in those things. Bud, you got your finger on the pulse of community and crime. What's happened with crime in Chilliwack over the past 20 years that you've been connected and involved?
Well, it's certainly changed, but it's not just Chilliwack. To be fair to Chilliwack, I remember my time here. I started working in Chilliwack in '92 as a dog handler, and then I had go a little farther than that. In '97, I was a sergeant running one of the watches that works the 12-hour shift here, and came back in charge of Chilliwack in 2002. And during my early time here, the number of calls involving guns and weapons was not remote, but it wasn't happening daily. It maybe not even weekly that you would get a complaint involving a firearm or a search warrant where you would be executing, where you'd find a cache of firearms. Those things didn't happen. And in Chilliwack today, like in many and possibly all the communities across the country, it's for cities our size, it's more frequent than we want. In some cases, daily. And just looking, at the newspaper that Paul's the editor of, and the pictures of search warrants where you're seeing tables full of cocaine, methamphetamine, fentanyl, heroin, money, semi-automatic weapons, sawed-off shotguns, handguns. It's a completely different environment than my earlier days here in Chilliwack.
And sometimes because we're focused on Chilliwack, and a lot of times people who don't leave Chilliwack, you'll often see comments on social media, Chilliwack, oh, Chilliwack. I remember being in Penticton and overhearing somebody in a cafe saying, oh, it's so Penticton. So it really is everywhere.
It is.
Not?
Yeah.
Aaron, you've done a lot of work in the court, and you must have seen changes, and you must also have in your mind things we could be doing better, especially within the court system and the justice system. What are your thoughts on what you've seen and how you think that system could be better?
So I think one of the challenges is that we look at the bail system. That's where I see a lot of the frustration, is that we're letting these people back out. I don't think that's necessarily the big issue. The big issue is when I get people into treatment centers, into detox centers, I think those are some of the areas that are perhaps more mismanaged. And I would have clients come back and say, I was trying to move in a better direction, but the person running the house that I was at was using and was recommending and offering me opportunities to use as well. And that's hard for people who are trying to get on that better track to move away from. So I don't think that some of these problems are coming from the court system. My work with Crown Counsel, the judges, Defense Counsel, we all want to get those people out and connected to resources that are going to stop the problem at the root cause. It's a matter of those resources actually being effective and making sure that there's more strength to hold those people there and help them through their issues and make sure that we have capable leadership in those roles.
So I have a sense that when somebody is referred to some kind of treatment outside of the justice system, that these are professionalized services that are run by provincial organizations certified to be doing the work they're doing. Is that not correct?
I would say that there are many of these places that have been shut down due to lack of proper care. There are organizations that are well respected within our community. PCRS is absolutely one of them. And the Native Court Workers has resources out in Vancouver, but they're not well understood by the public, and perhaps that public scrutiny would apply pressure for them to be better managed, so we have more confidence in them. But when the general public doesn't know about these resources, I think that there's an opportunity for them to go under the radar, and I think that that's, to me personally, where a lot of the challenges lie.
So I'm guessing that in our community, just looking at how things have evolved, the police in our community seem to be becoming more and more involved in things that aren't related to actual policing and crime. They're being called more and more to deal with situations that don't have to do with crime. Steve, do you have a sense of that in the work that you're doing, and what needs to happen in our community to better use those resources?
Absolutely. So we have several different outreach programs that run out here in Chilliwack, a couple newer ones that we're happy about too, and they're really ambitious to try to take that away from the police. But what we found is also a couple new programs like coordinated outreach, where we work with the police and see what can we learn from each other, collaborate, meet with the same people, and we found that to be like an awesome connection and really helping doing daily walks. We hope to expand to more hours with that too, but try to take away some of that from the police so they can do some of their other jobs. But that collaboration instead of complete separation, I prefer the collaboration.
Yeah.
I mean, mental health is, behind so much of what we see. And I mean, it seems like you see someone on the street suffering or using or what have you, and you can almost see the trauma in their eyes. And how can we deal with that? How can we get to the trauma?
That's a long story, right? Because trauma takes like 20 years to develop, so there's no one-day solution to get that, right? And so trauma can happen since they're a kid, which can affect the brain, and which we've talked about before in many meetings, of like that affects like their pain sequence, like so they can't really resolve pain that comes into their life, so then they're seeking drugs to resolve that pain. And so it's just like there's a whole story behind every single person,
Right.
which once you unpack that whole story and you get connected to them, then it's a process of recovery. But like I said, it's a process. It's not a quick fix. And I know there's a solution of like get them all into treatment and then we won't see them. And that's not always the treatment go-to solution either.
No.
So, Bud, you've been involved in a committee I'm very well aware of over the past couple of years. And one of the things that seems to be being reinforced throughout that process is that early intervention is the key, dealing with some of these issues before they happen in young kids. Is that what is coming out of the discussions that you've been having?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to comment on that. But do you mind if I go back to a
No,
comment
please.
that Aaron made? It was only yesterday that we met with the Regional Crown Counsel that's responsible for the supervision of the Chilliwack Crown Counsel office. And one of the things that was top on the list for that discussion was actually bail. And I agree fully with Aaron that there's a whole cadre of people that bail is not the issue, right? But there's also a large population of people who should not be released on bail. These are not people that need treatment. Well, they need some kind of treatment, but they don't have mental health issues. They may have some drug issues, but it's all about money. Many of these people are involved in organized crime. They need to be taken off the street until there's a way to deal with them. And what we're seeing with bail is there seems to be a general reluctance in using the conditions of bail, which were well laid out in the criminal code, the grounds for bail. And there seems to be a deaf ear for some of them when they get into the court system. And we talked about yesterday as a prime example, it happened here in Chilliwack, where 3 individuals from Alberta showed up in Chilliwack with a stolen car. They were found in the car, they were arrested, they were brought before the courts, they were released on conditions on bail. not to be in a stolen car and keep the peace and be of good behavior. Within 24 hours, they stole another car. They ended up out in the Boston Bar area, got in a pursuit with the police. Police got the vehicle stopped. One of them jumped into the river and died. The two were arrested, back to court. They were released on conditions not to be in stolen cars and be of good behavior. They stole another car. This all happened within a 5-day period and took that stolen car to Alberta, where they were again arrested and remanded in custody. So I agree in many, many, many respects that bail is not the problem when it comes to individual. It's about having the resources to be available to help them. But there is also a cadre of people that need to stay in jail. They're not listening. We call them chronic, prolific offenders, priority offenders. They're creating a disproportionate amount of the crime here in Chilliwack and the Fraser Valley. And that was a lot about what the meeting was, as you know, yesterday, is trying to come up with a solution to deal with them and to help the police. Now, when we talk back to your original question about early intervention, you know, I'm with Steve right from the start of the race on what he's talking about. I can't tell you how many times in my career, even as a young patrol officer, whether I was in the Northwest Territory or Newfoundland or Alberta or BC, where I've left the house and I've said to my partner or somebody who was there, that kid doesn't stand a chance. He or she, they do not stand a chance. And, you know, even now, because of the conditions in the house, and it's only now understanding from spending time with Steve and others as part of this community safety task force, that you start understanding and believing because you're hearing it. And I think intuitively we know it, but it needed to be said by people like Steve about what some of these precursors are to making wrong decisions later in life while you're a child. And I won't get into them. Steve knows them far more than I do. But even today, when I talk to the officers and we get our briefings on the things that the police can brief us on, I'm hearing names now that are committing murders. They're the subject of executed search warrants with weapons. Just recently, one of them was killed, I think, in Edmonton. A little while past, somebody was killed in another country. I remember dealing with them when they were teenagers here in Chilliwack in the late 90s. And now look.
And I see that in the courthouse, I sit in court and listen to hearings quite often. And when you hear sentencing hearings, and sometimes you hear somebody's history, and always when you hear the most serious offender has the most insane upbringing, where there's, I'm told somebody who was recently killed, I think we're talking about the same person, someone told me his uncle taught him to steal his first car when he was 6 years old. And exactly what chance do these people have without any intervention? I don't know what that would be if they're...
But I think it even goes way before that, right? And
sure.
Like, as we learned from Steve, and I'm happy to give it to him, but things like having a breakfast, right? And some of there's a high positive correlation between many of these, but Steve's far better suited than I am.
No. I just totally respect that conversation continued. That conversation has been brought up several times, and I'll kind of explain a tiny bit of it, but it's one of you guys were the first people to actually continue that conversation and bring it forward, because prevention is one of the hardest things to fund. So if you go to the end of the stream, you got, say, incarceration, and say roughly 40% of the people incarcerated did their crime while under the influence of drugs or alcohol. You're like, okay, well, we need to get people into drugs and alcohol treatment. Well, why are they in drug and alcohol treatment, right? And so it just keeps going back. And the speech from the throne is continually for Canada, like, oh, we need to do fast intervention with trauma, but no one will fund it. So if something happened negative, and I hope nothing happens negative to you, you do not have free counseling for trauma counseling. You might have a couple options with long wait lists in Chilliwack. You have to wait till that trauma turns into addiction or mental health to be funded for your treatment at its most expensive and painful state for you. Instead of it being early intervention, that's what we're referencing right now. Right. So, but give me someone that'll fund upstream like that. That's my hard part.
And there's so much evidence that suggests that investment pays huge dividends.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about some of that when we come back. We're going to take a quick break and recognize our sponsors, and we're going to be back with this incredible group to talk more about safety, crime, and some of the issues that relates to in our community.
Okay, welcome back. So we're talking crime here today with our guests, and we're gonna dive back into what we were just talking about with Aaron, talking about how Indigenous, through Indigenous lens, what you see at the courthouse when you were a Native court worker.
Yeah, I think that many Indigenous people are coming at this from experiences of trauma throughout our history. And one of the challenges is that living on reserve in many circumstances is so different than living in the city of Chilliwack. And so you have individuals who don't follow alarm clocks, who aren't used to following schedules. And then we have a court system that says, be here at 9 a.m., ready to go. And what the Native Court Workers and Counseling Association noticed nearly 50 years ago is that they're more likely to plead guilty earlier on in the court process to get out of a place that maybe they don't feel reflected in, that they don't feel well understood. And so I think that there's a lot of progress being made in terms of Crown Counsel being more attentive to the unique circumstances of Indigenous people. But I think one of the biggest things we need to do a better job of is inspiring individuals who are facing this court system to not feel defined by what happened in their family's past, what happened in their community's past, and to look at what could their life be if they didn't have all this weight on their shoulders. What is their potential? And asking them those questions alongside treatment questions and how they can do a better job of dealing with addictions or mental health issues is, who do you want to be beyond all of these issues? And I think that that's something I noticed that gets so overlooked because we're trying to fix the problem that we forget these people are individuals who could be entrepreneurs, they could be business owners, they could be mental health service providers, and they don't get asked what they wanted to be when they grow up. And I think that missing that question turns them into their trauma. And I worry about that with Indigenous people is because we look at what happened with Indian residential schools or the 60s scoop or colonization, but we are not our traumas. We endured all of those things and are still here today. And now it's an interest of where can we take our culture? And I think the same needs to be done for individuals facing mental health issues and trauma. Is you are not just this, you are far more than that. And if you reach your full potential, you start a business that we enjoy, we have food, we have culture that we can experience now because you did reach your full potential. And I think that sometimes gets missed in all of this.
Are young Indigenous people getting that support? That what you just said there sounded like a great
Yeah, I would say
speech.
that the mural that we have of Inez Louis is a huge statement. The reason I started the podcast was a belief that we don't point to the people we admire enough. We don't say this is someone to work towards being like. Maybe they're not perfect, but let's look at what they've done well. Let's try and glean some knowledge on how you can learn from their experiences. They've lived a life, and I think that that's something Indigenous culture does a good job of. We look to our elders, and that's something I saw many clients put their head down and listen attentively when elders speak. It's something I think is missing from Western culture, that we can look to individuals who have lived a meaningful life and who have knowledge and wisdom to pass on. And I think sometimes we forget to look at that wisdom piece of what does it look like to be a good steward in your community.
Should there be a different system in place for Indigenous folks that come into contact with the justice system?
Personally, I do not like First Nations court. I understand the intent, and perhaps the organization that I work with wouldn't agree with me, but I don't think that the cultural benefits that Indigenous people utilize, like sweat lodges, which Eddie Gardner runs, I think that is where counseling and nurturing and growth can take place. I don't like the idea that that's being done in a courtroom in front of other people. I've been to First Nations court. It was not a place that I thought, I think it felt good to the participants, to the judge, to Crown Counsel. It felt like we were going in the right direction. It felt warm and fuzzy because you were getting to hear this person's hard journey. But that should be done in a counseling office. That should be done with proper providers. But I think we can make there's not good research on that yet, but it can feel so good that we want to expand that program because we feel like we're on the right track, even though there's not a lot of evidence to suggest it impacts recidivism rates. My challenge is, as a Native court worker, I would connect them with resources they can go to whenever they need to. There's an open door policy with the resources that I was connecting them with. With First Nations court, you get to go there by pleading guilty, and a lot of those resources are in that room, so you need to go back into court to receive those. And to me, that's the goal of the court workers, from what my manager said, was we're trying to create those spaces in between when people are in the court system. We're trying to create that gap. It doesn't mean we're going to get them down to no more crime ever. It's just creating that gap. And I think that First Nations Court moves in the opposite direction of thinking, we need to get you back into First Nations Court. And I think that that's an error long term.
That's very interesting. Now, every one of you has had experience, broad experience, and I'm sure the research you've done when you were doing law school, in your schooling, and Bud, in your life experience and your work experience, you've seen other places where good things are happening. Where should we be looking to get better answers for what we're doing? What are the things that we need to be looking at for our own community that are being done somewhere else that we could do here? Forget about what they cost, because money's just money. Governments spend it all the time. What should we be doing that you've seen working other places? Steve, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think the solution would make people feel a bit uncomfortable, which means it hasn't been tried yet. That's a good thing. So if you feel complete comfort with it, it's probably been tried and it doesn't work. Like, oh, move everyone out of the way, or just hold them in prison for the rest of their life. I kind of like what Aaron's saying of just who are they behind the crime? Who are they behind the addiction? Can we get them to learn their own identity behind that? So it's a vast answer. Like, take Portugal when they decriminalized drugs, and that took years to develop that whole system. And it's specific to Portugal. You can't copy paste and put it in Chilliwack. But they took the time and research to look at their city to say, what is all going on here, and let's create. And they have, I think, 82 different solutions that they all put in, and then they implemented it over the course of, I don't know how many years it is, 12 years now. But it's a long process.
Bud, what are you seeing? You've traveled extensively around the world to do with policing. Where are some of the places that are really getting it right in terms of crime reduction strategies, in terms of building safer communities? What have you seen out there?
Well, I'm very familiar with the Portugal model. I think there are other models, but for me, when we say we talk about community-based policing and prevention as being the core and the pinnacles, I don't think that in any way is right, to be honest with you. I think we have to go further back. And I think as a society, as a province, a city, a country, if we want to succeed, we have to succeed and invest in early intervention with children, and give them the tools, give them the treatment where it needs to be given, give them the support, give them the counseling, so that as they grow and go through life, percentage-wise, we can count on them making better decisions. When they're faced with that left road or right road, which one am I going to take? This one isn't a good future. This one is a good future. So what do we do with children as they're brought up to make them, when they get to that fork in the road, that they take the right road? I think that's where we have to invest in. But if I take that a step farther and just deal with the here and now, I think there's things that we as a country, certainly a province and as a city, have to do. We have people on our street, and we talk to the police. They come in and they tell us anecdotally a 2 a.m. story where they find a young girl who's absolutely cratered. She wants help. The time is now. She needs help. She wants help. She's asking for help. She's begging for help. And the officers don't have a place to take them, or there's not a place to go. There's nobody to call. And now we've got police officers offering treatment. That's not their job. That's not what they're trained to do. And that's not what they should be doing. And we're seeing some headway with Fraser Health. Obviously, it's a provincial body. This is BC, where they are now investing, I think, 12 resources, frontline resources here. They call them, is it DART?
No, iHeart.
iHeart, whatever the acronym is. And we're hearing back from policing now that they're actually on the street, and the police have somebody to call when they meet this individual. It's still not perfect, but it's a step in the right direction. And I think lastly, for a place like Chilliwack, it's the perception of crime. And we've talked about that. I happen to believe Chilliwack's a pretty place to live. If I didn't think so, I wouldn't be living here. I think it is safe. But there's a perception of not being safe, and that becomes the individual's reality. And you know, what we see, and you brought up the downtown east side, and we spoke a little bit about it at the break. One of the reasons why the downtown east side works, and it is a community, is the people who are homeless have a place to go. In Chilliwack, they don't. Many of our shelter beds are closed at 7 in the morning, and you have to go out, and you're not welcome again till 7 or 8 at night. Well, the homeless people have absolutely nowhere to go, so they're gathering. They are a community. They are a society in themselves. They have friends. They have relationships. And so where are they gathering? They're gathering in parks, where they're taking all of their lifelong belongings, sometimes in a shopping cart. They're using the seats, the chairs in the downtown, the benches. They're using the bus stops, and it's giving people a sense of not being safe. I believe they are safe, but it's a sense that they're not safe. And these people don't want to be tying up a bench at a bus stop, but we have nowhere for them to go. And as soon as we can develop that place for them to go, as I've heard you, Clint, talk passionately about, where they have a place to go in the day, they can have a cup of coffee, they can have a shower, there will be somebody there that offers them a chance at treatment when it's their time and when they want it. They do have somebody that will talk to them that's a trained professional and a counselor. And until we set that up, we're going to stay in this quagmire of complaints about, I don't feel safe. They were at the bus stop. They were in the park. They were shooting up in front of the Progress. And until we fix that, this is just going to be
Why can't we get to that, though? Because that's so obvious.
We're trying, Paul. We are trying. And at every meeting, we're banging the table. Okay. And we seem to get, and I would welcome Clint. He's being quiet, but he's been with me at these tables where we make progress for treatment and for on the road, and we think, we high five and we leave, and then a week later we go, what? Somebody came up with another idea? Like, where'd that come from? Usually it's Victoria, right? But we need to work harder there.
It's a challenge. Aaron, from an Indigenous perspective, which is something you can bring to the table, we're seeing in our downtown, the folks that are homeless, there's an overrepresentation of people who are Indigenous in that group. People want to believe they're from somewhere else. That's sort of what you often hear. Well, there's other people, in fact, the population of people in our community that are homeless, people want to believe they've come from somewhere else to be here. That's not true, is it?
I am not sure on the statistics on that, but I would say that when we talk about housing as an issue, it's been an issue in Indigenous communities for over 35 years. Squaw First Nation particularly hasn't had new housing built in 35 years, and they don't have economic development to pull on to build more housing. And so I've had clients from various communities who had homes, who were doing okay, they were just barely getting by, and then their house burns down. And now they're living in downtown Chilliwack, and they're relying on resources. And these were people who fell down a rabbit hole and ended up in a world that they weren't familiar with. But because of a lack of housing, I think that that's one of the biggest steps we can take. Is when I was growing up, I lived in downtown Chilliwack, and there were rougher type people, but they had a place to go to at the end of the day. They had a place where it was maybe less chaotic, where they had a room. They had a spot to gather themselves and think of where their life could go. But when you're sleeping on the side of the road, or you're waiting for a bed filled with other people, there's no opportunity for you to reflect on where you'd like to take this life that you're living. And for me, when we're talking about inspiration, I look at Detroit, and I know it seems like an odd one, but some of the people who pulled me in a better direction were rappers who were enduring what happened to Detroit 20 years ago. And they were my inspiration not to want to go down a path of gangs when I was invited to join those. There was a belief that maybe there's something about myself that I can build and grow into that is worthwhile. And I think that that's something that so many people early in their years feel like everybody is in the same boat as me. There's no opportunity to be something different. And I think this is a particular challenge with First Nation communities, where your next door neighbor isn't a lawyer, isn't a judge, isn't an accountant, isn't someone where you'd aspire to be like, and that can be so discouraging. And so I think music is one of those roots, and I think Detroit is just an example of bringing out musical genius that inspires young people to think their life could be more.
I think that's really important. The role that, and I would another passion of mine, but I would think the development of culture, whether it's Indigenous culture or our own culture, and the celebration of that in a community is a way to bring some of that out. I don't think we do near enough celebrating as non-Indigenous people the Indigenous culture that's all around us, and it is so rich and amazing, but it's not something that we get to celebrate very often together, and I think that would be a key to bringing some of those things out.
So I have one thought on that. I just interviewed Caroline Phelps, who runs Squatch Eyes Lodge, which is an Indigenous hotel out in Vancouver, and she talked about going to Indian Day School and the effects that it had on her hands because they were hit so many times when she was attending the school, and she didn't want to be defined by that, and so she got the surgery she needed on her hands. Now she works at the lodge, but she also did what's called tribal journeys, where she travels from Washington all the way to Vancouver Island and gets to connect with her culture, hear about other people's cultures, and really immerse herself in something other than what she went through in the past. And I think, to your point, encouraging people to connect with a culture, whether it's Indigenous or their own, whether it's connecting with the church, connecting with some sort of thing that is bigger than yourself, I think is so important for people to not get stuck in getting too lost in their own challenges and traumas.
Absolutely. One of the biggest issues that drives crime, and we touched on this a little bit, seems to be drugs, and the fact that and everybody's story is different, but drugs are at the root of so much of the crime that happens in a community, whether it's drug dealers, people dealing drugs, or whether it's someone who's addicted to drugs, whose only way to survive is to get involved in, say, petty theft or whatever it is. There are countries that are starting, and we mentioned Portugal as one of them, are countries that are starting to look at the issue of providing those drugs, or at the very least decriminalizing those, so that we can take the money and the cost to people out of that equation and say, yeah, you're addicted and we get that and it's not a good thing, but having to pay all that money out is a bad thing as well. So are we getting close to the notion of safe supply of drugs, or the complete decriminalization, and in fact giving people what they need in order to kind of get them stable, in order for them to build a future, as Aaron has said? Where are we? Where do you think we are in that? I know this is a tough discussion for a 34-year veteran of the RCMP.
It's actually not.
No,
But
he's good.
I want, why don't you start, Bud, and then we'll go.
So I don't think the secret is legalizing it. Because if you legalize it, you're still getting it from a source that's not provided. So it doesn't. I don't think that solves the problem. We go back, and I've heard over my years, like safe injection sites, and I think, are you kidding me, right? There's nothing safe about an injection site if you're buying street drugs, because you have no idea what's in the drug you're injecting, so there's nothing safe about it. But, I think the secret moving forward is that we have to have places where people under supervision can use drugs, and to make it, and before they use the drugs are tested to find out if there's fentanyl in it or if there's something else in it. Is it a clean needle? But to make that even better, I think the drugs have to be provided, and I think that's the way to get people to understand their disease, to want to look for help, to get help. It would close the overdose rates that we are seeing skyrocketing in this province and in this country. But I don't think the government of Canada is there yet, where they're willing to provide the safe supply of heroin and other opiates that people are using. But unlike Portugal. But I think when the government moves to that place where an addict can come into a place, they're an addict they need to use, where the drugs are provided to them, where there's somebody there to talk to them, where there's options for them when the time is right. I think that's the space we need to be in. But as long as young ladies are looking to prostitution, as are young men, as to breaking and entering, petty crime, turning neighborhoods into ghettos, to earn money to buy drugs off of dealers and criminals. I think that's going to be just an ever-ending rat trap until we come to terms with that and look to other places. And Portugal's just one of them, where the government does provide the drugs, and you see the addiction rates start to drop. You see overdose deaths plummet. I think that's the place we have to get to. But what we're doing now is not working. Surprised you, 33 years.
No, not really. I set you up. I knew that was where we were going.
Might have surprised me.
No, I really appreciate Bud's view on that as well. And it's also important to take a couple steps back. Like, what really helped me on this whole topic is just look at why are people using drugs? And there's like, oh, they have no self-control, or, all these different things. But you take a couple steps back, just look at the research and look at the brain. So fentanyl, like heroin, these are opiates. They work on a certain part of our brain, the same part of our brain that works on connection and hugs and like connection between people. So when I get someone that's been using heroin for 40 years in my counseling office, and I don't say, hey, have you thought about quitting drugs? And I think about like, hey, tell me about the connection to your parents. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about if there's trauma, that sort of thing. The breaks in connection. These people are starving for relationship. And you get a community, much to Aaron's point, that might judge them and label them. Well, then it's just reinforcing the whole thing. And as to a safe supply, yeah, right. If we don't supply it, they'll go find it. And what they're finding, I have people coming saying, hey, I don't know what's in this, and can you supervise me while I use it, and getting them right into an overdose. So it's currently happening. So you can deny saying we shouldn't do it. Well, okay, they'll find the drug somewhere else, and you'll see more deaths, and you'll see more of the problem that we have. Yeah. It's a step in the right direction. That's all.
Aaron, what's your thoughts?
I had the pleasure of interviewing John Haidt, who actually did research on Insight from the University of the Fraser Valley. And one of his points was, look at how we approached alcohol. When we had Prohibition, alcohol was getting more and more strong and potent, and moonshine was common. And today, most people drink beer. It's way less potent in its effectiveness, and most people are proud to drink so many beers. But we moved in a different direction, and it had an effect. I think we're starting to see the same sort of effects with cannabis, which is he's doing research on in Abbotsford, on what we're seeing with legalization. He has a lot of concerns about how that was rolled out, but I think that cannabis maybe put forward this idea of moving in the direction that you're kind of describing, which is that I think we put this on the police a lot of the time, and that maybe doesn't help anything. And it incentivizes more crime and trying to be more strategic, and then it creates a rat race on who's got the best utensils to figure out who's committing these crimes, and nothing's being accomplished. And so I think it's perhaps a distraction in some circumstances away from helping people.
The discussion's been fascinating. I wish we had all day, because I think more and more we need to be working with our communities too, to be saying people who use drugs aren't just bad people. They're not people who said, I want to be bad, I want to use drugs. There's often a background to that, as you've said, Steve, where, and in some cases, it's people who've been injured, and they go to the doctor and they get the pills they need to take that injury pain away, and then that becomes an addiction which develops. Others, it comes from trauma as kids or wherever it is. And I think people need to recognize that is what's bringing people to that place, not we've got good people and bad people. And so if they're bad people, we should throw away the key. If they're good people, we'll keep it.
Everyone has a story.
They sure do. They sure do. It's been great. I think we're pretty much out of time, though. So I want to thank our guests today, Steve Esau, Bud Mercer, Aaron Pete. It's been a delight to have you here. I hope you've enjoyed your time with us, and we look forward to chatting again on topics of interest to Chilliwack Now.
Thanks for me too. I'm Paul Henderson, and my guest host is Clint Hames. We're looking at some interesting topics for future shows: social media and its influence on our lives, inclusion, are symbols meaningful, or is there much more we can do to build a community where everyone belongs? Thanks for joining us on Hames and Henderson, Chilliwack Now.